The ice in my glass had melted down to jagged little islands, losing the battle against the ambient heat of the room. Around me, the hotel bar hummed with the specific frequency of expensive leisure. Low laughter, the clink of crystal, the murmur of deals being closed over single malt scotch. It was October 14th, my 42nd birthday, a date that technically required celebration, but currently felt more like a diagnosis I was ignoring. I sat perfectly still in the center of the noise, a void in the middle of the crowd, wondering if anyone else could hear the deafening silence radiating off me. This place was designed for people who wanted to feel important without actually doing anything. Chrome surfaces caught the low light, refracting it into sharp, clean lines that matched the architecture of my own life. I shifted slightly on the velvet stool, the fabric catching against the wool of my trousers. I was wearing a charcoal suit tailored to within a millimeter of its life, crisp white shirt, no jewelry except the watch that cost more than my first car. It was the uniform of capability, the uniform of the chief of surgery. It told the world I was unbreakable, efficient, and entirely self-sufficient. But inside the fabric, my bones felt like they were made of lead. It had been a 14-hour shift, 2 valve replacements, and a complex bypass that had gone sideways before I wrestled it back from the brink. My brain was still running through the sutures, the blood pressure monitors, the rhythmic beeping that dictated whether a father went home to his kids or went to the morgue. That was the job. You hold a human heart in your hands, you fix the broken machinery, and you pretend it doesn't take a piece of you every single time. I looked at my hands now, resting on the polished marble of the bar. They were steady. They were always steady. My insurance premiums depended on them being steady. They were scrubbed raw, the skin pale and dry from the constant chemical assault of hospital-grade soap. Right now, they were wrapped around a tumbler of Glenfiddich I didn't even want. I hated scotch. It tasted like burning wood and ego, but it was what people like me were supposed to drink. It was part of the performance. I took a long, slow sip, letting the burn distract me from the heavy exhaustion pooling at the base of my skull. The liquid was harsh, a sharp reprimand against my tongue. I didn't wince. I never winced. That was the rule. You don't show pain, you don't show fatigue, and you certainly don't show loneliness. I had built a wall so high and so thick that even my colleagues, people I stood shoulder to shoulder with inside open chest cavities, couldn't see over it. They wished me a polite happy birthday, doctor, in the hallway, and I had nodded, thanked them, and walked away before they could ask if I had plans. Because the answer was no. The answer was absolutely always no. The bar was getting crowded. A group of consultants in the booth behind me were laughing too loudly, their voices grating against my nerves like a scalpel on bone. I stared at my reflection in the mirror behind the rows of bottles. The woman staring back looked composed. Severe, maybe. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, efficient knot. Her eyes were dark and guarded. She looked like she owned the place, or at least could buy it if she wanted to. She looked like a stranger. I swirled the amber liquid, watching the vortex form and collapse. I was 42 years old, at the pinnacle of my career, respected, feared, and wealthy. And I was spending the night of my birth sitting alone in a hotel lobby bar, nursing a drink I detested, waiting for, what? Permission to go home to an empty apartment? Permission to stop pretending? I put the glass down with a precise clack. The sound was small but final. I was about to signal for the check to retreat back to the sterile safety of my penthouse when the sensation hit me. It wasn't a sound or a touch. It was the distinct, prickly awareness of being observed. Not the way patients looked at me with fear or desperate hope. and not the way men in bars usually looked at me, as a challenge to be conquered or a fortress to be sieged. This felt different. It felt clinical, assessing, like someone was reading my chart from across the room and finding discrepancies in the data. I kept my eyes forward, watching the mirror. The bartender was moving down the line. I hadn't paid much attention to her when I sat down. She had been a blur of motion at the far end, but now she was closer. She wasn't rushing. She moved with a fluid, deliberate economy that my surgeon's brain immediately recognized and respected. No wasted energy. Every reach, every pour, every wipe of the counter was calculated. She stopped directly in front of me. She didn't ask if I wanted another round. She didn't smile the vacuous customer service smile I was used to. She just stood there, drying a crystal mixing glass with a white cloth, her gaze locked on mine in the reflection. She wasn't looking at the suit. She wasn't looking at the expensive watch. She was looking right at the tension I was holding in my jaw, the pressure point I was unknowingly digging my thumb into on the side of the glass. She saw the hairline cracks in the facade. She moved toward me, and the ambient noise of the bar seemed to dampen as if she carried her own sphere of silence. Her name tag, pinned straight on the black vest, read Luna. It was a soft name for a woman who moved with the precision of a predator. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't lingering either. She covered the distance between the service well and my stool in 3 long strides, her eyes never leaving mine in the mirror until she was standing directly across from me, separated only by the cold slab of marble. She didn't ask what I wanted. She didn't offer a menu or ask if I was enjoying the evening. Instead, she reached out, her hand confident, fingers long and unadorned, and slid the half-full glass of Glenfiddich away from me. She moved it out of reach, banishing it to the spill mat with a dismissive clink. "Excuse me," I started, the authority in my voice automatic, the tone I used when a resident handed me the wrong clamp. My hand hovered over the empty space where the glass had been. "You were finished," she said. Her voice was low, a rich contralto that seemed to vibrate through the countertop. It wasn't polite, it was factual. "You've been nursing it for 20 minutes, and you haven't taken a sip without wincing since you sat down. You hate it." I opened my mouth to argue, to reinstate the natural order where I was the customer, and she was the service, but she was already moving again. She turned her back to me, reaching for a bottle on the top shelf with a stretch that pulled her vest tight against her waist. I watched the line of her spine, the way her shoulder blades moved beneath the fabric. There was a competence there that arrested me. She worked quickly, mixing something in a heavy crystal glass. No measuring jiggers. She poured by feel, a splash of clear liquid, a dash of bitters that smelled like roots and earth, a twist of citrus peel that she expressed over the glass with a sharp snap of her wrist. She placed the new drink in front of me. It was pale green, cloudy with ice, garnished with a sprig of rosemary that looked like it had been plucked from a garden 5 minutes ago. "Drink," she commanded softly. Not a request. I looked at the glass, then up at her. Her eyes were dark, framed by lashes that cast shadows on her cheekbones. She was waiting, forearms resting on the bar, leaning into my space just enough to make the air between us feel thin, charged. I lifted the glass. The scent hit me first. Clean, sharp, herbal. It smelled like rain and fresh soil, a stark contrast to the smoky peat of the scotch. I took a sip. It was cold, complex, and deeply grounding. The knot of tension at the base of my throat loosened just a fraction. "Better," she stated. It wasn't a question. "It is," I admitted, setting the glass down. "How did you know?" "I pay attention," Luna said, her gaze dropping to my hands, then back to my face. "And happy birthday." My breath hitched. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't shown ID. How? You've checked your phone 4 times in the last half hour, she said, her voice dropping lower, intimate and cutting. Not the I'm busy check, the did I miss a message check. You're wearing a suit that costs more than my car, but you're sitting at the bar alone on a Tuesday night. And you have that specific look in your eye that people get when they realize another year has gone by and the math doesn't quite add up to what they were promised. I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck, a mix of indignation and shame. I was used to being analyzed, but usually it was about my surgical outcomes, not my emotional deficits. You're very presumptuous for a bartender. And you're very tense for a woman who's supposed to be relaxing, she countered unfazed. She reached across the bar, her hand hovering near mine for a second before she adjusted a napkin. The proximity sent a jolt through me, a static shock that had nothing to do with the carpet. Look at your hand, doctor. You're holding that glass like you're afraid it's going to jump off the counter. I looked down. My knuckles were white. I hadn't even realized I was gripping it. I forced my fingers to uncurl one by one. There, she said softly. You treat your body like a machine. Efficient, rigid. But machines break when you run them redline for too long. She wasn't looking at me like a patron anymore. She was looking at me like a puzzle she had already solved. The barrier of the bar felt insignificant. She had found the tired woman underneath the title in less than 5 minutes. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I straightened my spine, a reflex more than a truth. I'm functioning perfectly. Luna tilted her head, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. I didn't say, you were broken. I said, you were running redline. And I know exactly what you need to throttle down. The noise of the consultants behind me faded into a dull buzz. The clinking of glasses, the jazz music, the lobby chatter, it all receded. There was only the woman in the vest, the herbal taste of the drink on my tongue, and the sudden, terrifying realization that for the first time all day, someone was actually seeing me. Not the chief of surgery, just me. And I had absolutely no idea how to defend against it. She didn't pull back. If anything, she leaned in further, her elbows resting on the polished wood, invading the invisible, sterile field I kept around myself at all times. In the hospital, crossing that line without a scrub-in protocol was unthinkable. Here, it felt like oxygen. You're diagnosing me? I said, my voice trying to find its usual sharp edge, but failing, softening into something that sounded dangerously like curiosity. Is that part of the service? Amateur psychiatry with every cocktail. It's not psychiatry, Luna replied, her eyes tracking the movement of my throat as I swallowed. It's observation. I watch people all night, doctor. I see the ones who are here to celebrate, the ones who are here to forget, and the ones like you who are here because they don't know how to stop moving. She reached out again, her hand brushing the condensation from the side of my glass. Her fingers were long, the nails short and clean. Utilitarian hands, capable hands. I found myself staring at them, imagining the dexterity required to garnish a drink with that much precision, wondering if that steady grace translated to other things. And what is it you think I need? I asked. The question hung in the air, heavier than I intended. It wasn't just about the drink anymore. The subtext was thick enough to choke on. Luna held my gaze, her expression unreadable, but intense. I know exactly what you need, she said. The words slow, deliberate. You don't need the scotch. You don't need the numbness. You need permission. Permission to put the weight down, she murmured. To stop being the one who holds the ceiling up. To let someone else make a decision for 5 minutes. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. My breath caught. I spent my life making decisions. Cut here, clamp there, restart the heart, call the time of death. Thousands of micro choices that carried the weight of worlds. The idea of relinquishing that, of handing the controls to someone else, was terrifying. And yet, hearing her say it, seeing the absolute certainty in her dark eyes, I felt a sudden, vertigo-inducing rush of longing. "You're very confident," I whispered. "I'm right," she countered simply. She shifted her weight, and the movement brought a wave of her scent across the bar. It wasn't perfume. It was subtler, bitters and citrus zest, yes, but underneath that, something warm and woodsy. Cedar, maybe. Or just clean, warm skin. It was a grounding scent, devoid of the antiseptic sharpness of the hospital. It smelled like life. It smelled like the kind of safety I hadn't felt in years. I watched her pulse flutter steadily in the hollow of her throat. My own heart rate was climbing, a traitorous rhythm against my ribs. The exhaustion that had been dragging at my bones all day suddenly shifted, transforming from a dead weight into a raw, exposed sensitivity. I felt thin, like the skin barrier between me and the world had dissolved. "I should go," I said, but I didn't move. My hands stayed wrapped around the glass she had given me. My body refused to obey the command to retreat. "You could," Luna agreed. She didn't move either. She didn't wipe the counter or check on the other patrons. Her focus was entirely, maddeningly on me. "You could go back to your quiet apartment and stare at the ceiling, or you could finish that drink and let me be right." It was a challenge. It was an invitation. The power dynamic, usually so firmly tilted in my favor by virtue of my title and my bank account, had completely inverted. I was the one frozen, uncertain, while she stood there with the calm assurance of someone who held all the cards. She wasn't serving me, she was handling me. And God help me, I wanted her to. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. The fatigue had stripped away my ability to construct a defense. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the bar dimmed, shifting from a warm glow to a twilight intimacy. The music softened. It was last call, the signal that the public performance was ending. Around us, the few remaining groups began to shuffle, gathering coats and settling tabs. But in our corner, the air didn't settle. It tightened. The space between us felt charged, a magnetic field that hummed with potential energy. Luna didn't look at the lights. She kept her eyes on mine, waiting. She knew she had me. She knew I wasn't going anywhere. The exodus was gradual, then absolute. The consultants in the corner gathered their briefcases, their laughter fading into the plush carpet of the lobby. The couple by the window finished their wine and left hand in hand. One by one, the other patrons drifted away, pulled by the gravity of their own lives, until the room was stripped of its social insulation. The jazz track ended, replaced by a silence that felt heavy, thick with things unsaid. I should have left with them. My driver was likely circling the block, or parked in the loading zone, checking his watch. My phone was undoubtedly accumulating emails that required my authorization. But I remained fixed to the stool, anchored by the green glass and the dark eyes of the woman standing opposite me. Luna didn't rush me out. She didn't put the chairs up on the tables or aggressively wipe down the counter to signal the end of service. Instead, she moved to the register, tapped a few keys, and the receipt printer purred. She ripped the paper off, but didn't hand it to me. She set it aside, under a heavy glass weight. "I have 10 minutes of closing duties," she said. Her voice didn't carry across the room. It was pitched perfectly for the 2 feet of space between us. "You can leave, go back to your penthouse, and wake up tomorrow exactly the same as you did today. Or You can wait. It wasn't a question. It was a fork in the road. And if I wait? I asked, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. I didn't ask for outcomes. I dealt in probabilities, in risk assessment. This was a variable I couldn't calculate. Then we stopped pretending, she said simply. She turned away before I could answer, moving to the sink. I watched her, fascinated. I had spent 20 years perfecting the art of efficiency, the economy of movement required to stitch a vessel before a patient bled out. I recognized that same mastery in her. She stripped the bar with a terrifying competence. Bottles were corked and shelved. Mats were pulled and rinsed. Her hands, wet and strong, moved with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I found myself watching her forearms as she worked. She had rolled her sleeves up past the elbows, revealing skin that flexed with every scrub of the counter. There was a scar on her left wrist, a thin white line that disappeared into the shadow of her ulna. I wanted to trace it. I wanted to know the history of it. For the first time in 2 decades, I was waiting. I was the chief of surgery. I was the one people waited for. In exam rooms, in board meetings, in family gatherings I arrived late to. I dictated the timeline. But here, in this dim, empty bar, I was on her time. And the illicit thrill of it, the surrender of control, was a drug more potent than the alcohol. Time, Luna said. I blinked, snapping out of the trance. The bar was pristine. The lights behind the bottles were off. She was standing at the end of the counter, unbuttoning her vest. My breath caught in my throat. It was a mundane action, stripping off a uniform, but in the quiet of the room, it felt incredibly intimate. She shrugged the black vest off, revealing the crisp white shirt underneath, tailored to fit the curve of her waist. She looked less like an employee and more like a person. Real. Solid. Ready? She asked. I stood up. My legs felt steady, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Yes. We walked out of the bar together. We didn't touch, but the space between us was electric, a live wire humming with potential. We crossed the lobby, the sound of our footsteps distinct on the marble. My heels clicking sharp and authoritative, her boots soft and heavy. The night concierge looked up, his expression shifting from professional boredom to mild surprise as he saw the resident guest leaving with the bartender. The judgment barely registered. My focus was entirely on the woman walking beside me, whose stride matched mine perfectly. The automatic doors slid open, and the climate-controlled perfection of the hotel vanished. The night air hit us instantly, cold, raw, and smelling of exhaust and rain. It was a shock to the system, a physical reminder that I was leaving the sterile bubble I had lived in for years. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that I was off the map. Luna glanced at me, noting the shiver. She didn't offer me a jacket. She didn't treat me like a delicate thing. She just nodded toward the street, away from the line of waiting taxis. My car is this way, she said, unless you're afraid of a little walking. I looked at the line of black sedans, then at the dark street leading away from the city center. I'm not afraid, I lied. Good, Luna said, and for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a customer service smile. It was sharp, genuine, and dangerous. Because we're just getting started. We moved away from the sanitized glow of the hotel district, the streets gradually shedding their polished veneer for something grittier, darker, and infinitely more real. The pavement here was uneven, cracked by tree roots and neglect, a challenging terrain for Italian leather soles designed for boardroom carpets and operating theater floors. I should have been stumbling, my ankles protesting the uneven ground, but I found myself matching her cadence with a surprising ease. Luna walked with a long, loose stride, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a wool coat she'd pulled on over her white shirt. She didn't check behind her to see if I was keeping up. She knew I was. "You're quiet, doctor?" she said, her voice cutting through the damp air. We were passing a row of shuttered storefronts, a bodega with a flickering neon sign, a laundromat humming with the late-night cycle. "Regretting the decision to walk on the wild side yet?" "I don't have regrets," I replied. The reflex, automatic. "I have post-operative analyses." Luna laughed, a low, throaty sound that warmed the cold space between us. God, you really don't turn it off, do you? The precision, the detachment. She stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for a beat-up delivery truck to rumble past. When she looked at me, the street lamp caught the sharp angle of her jaw. "We're not in the OR anymore. You don't have to be the chief here. You can just be whoever you are when the scrubs come off." "I'm not sure I know who that is anymore," I admitted. The honesty surprised me. It was the cold, I told myself, the shock of the temperature stripping away my defenses. "Well," she said, stepping off the curb as the light changed. "Let's start with a name, unless doctor is on your birth certificate." "Evelyn," I said. It felt strange to say it without a title attached. Naked. "My name is Evelyn." "Evelyn," she repeated, testing the weight of it. She made it sound less like a label and more like a secret. "It suits you." Serious. Classic. We continued deeper into the city, moving toward the neighborhoods that tourists avoided and real estate developers drooled over. The architecture shifted from glass monoliths to pre-war brick, buildings that wore their fire escapes like iron jewelry. The air here smelled different, less like expensive perfume and ozone, and more like wet pavement, frying oil, and exhaust. It was a cacophony of scents that should have been repelling to my sanitized sensibilities. But instead, I inhaled it greedily. It felt alive in a way my penthouse never did. As we navigated a narrow stretch of sidewalk, flanked by scaffolding, the space between us compressed. I felt the sudden, hyper-aware proximity of her body next to mine. As we sidestepped a puddle of questionable origin, her arm brushed against mine, wool against wool, and the friction sent a jolt straight to my core. I found myself fixating on her movement, specifically the way she navigated the space. At one point, a group of loud teenagers spilled out of a doorway, blocking the path. Without breaking stride, Luna shifted, her body angling to shield mine slightly. It was a subtle, protective gesture. Her hand came out of her pocket, hovering for a split second near the small of my back to guide me through the gap. The proximity alone burned through the layers of my suit. My skin prickled, the nerves at my waist firing as if anticipating the weight of her palm. I realized with a start that I wanted her to complete the motion. I wanted her hand to settle there, to claim the space, to steer me not just around the crowd, but entirely. "You're staring at the pavement like it's a complex fracture," Luna noted, her voice dropping an octave, intimate, despite the street noise. "I'm watching my step," I lied. "These heels weren't made for this." "Then why wear them?" "Armor," I said simply. "Height, authority. The sound they make in the hallway makes interns scatter." "I don't think you need heels to make people scatter, Evelyn." She said my name with a deliberate slowness that made my breath catch. "I think you could clear a room with a look, but you don't have to clear the room with me." We turned a corner, and the wind picked up, biting through the thin fabric of my suit jacket. I shivered involuntarily. The cold was sharp, physical, but it stood in stark contrast to the heat radiating from the woman beside me. There was a tension building, a pressure system of desire that felt denser than the atmosphere around us. "Cold?" she asked. I suppressed a shiver, tightening my jaw. Just adjusting. You're freezing, she corrected. She stopped in front of a heavy iron door set into a brick archway. Good thing we're here. I looked up at the building. It was old, solid, with ivy clinging to the brickwork like veins. It was the antithesis of my world. No doorman, no marble lobby, just a keypad and a heavy door that looked like it required a shoulder to open. I haven't walked without a destination in 20 years, I whispered, the realization hitting me as we stood on the threshold. I always know where I'm going. I always have a schedule. Luna turned to me, her back to the door. In the dim light of the entryway, her eyes were dark pools, unreadable and pulling me in. You had a destination tonight, Evelyn. You just didn't know what it was until you got there. She punched a code into the keypad, the beep loud in the quiet street. The lock buzzed, a harsh, welcoming sound. She held the door open, her body blocking the wind, creating a pocket of stillness for me to step into. After you, she said. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Crossing this threshold meant leaving the last vestiges of the public world behind. It meant entering her space, her rules. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, heavy rhythm. I wasn't afraid of the neighborhood. I wasn't afraid of the stranger. I was afraid of how much I wanted to walk through that door and never walk back out. I stepped inside. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and by the time we reached the landing, the polished veneer of my world felt like a distant memory. Luna unlocked the door, the mechanism turning with a heavy, solid thunk, and pushed it open. I stepped across the threshold and stopped, overwhelmed by the immediate visceral sense of entering a living organism. My penthouse was a study in negative space. White walls, gray furniture, surfaces so clear they looked uninhabited. This place was a riot of life. Every horizontal surface seemed to hold a stack of books, their spines cracked and faded. Plants cascaded from the tops of shelves and huddled on the windowsill, their leaves reaching for the streetlights outside. The air was warm, dry, and smelled intensely of dried sage, old paper, and something sweet like vanilla tea. It wasn't the recycled, filtered air of the hospital. It was air that had been breathed, laughed in, and lived in. Welcome to the chaos, Luna said, closing the door behind us and shutting out the city noise. I stood in the center of the small living room, clutching my elbows, feeling oversized and rigid in the cozy space. It's different. Different from the museum you live in? She moved behind me. I stiffened, my muscles locking up, but she didn't touch me. Not yet. Relaxed, Evelyn. You're still holding your shoulders like you're expecting a blow. I'm fine, I said automatically. You're wearing a wet wool coat in a heated apartment? She countered softly. Let me take that. She stepped closer, her presence a warm pressure against my back. Her hands found the collar of my coat, her knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of my neck. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that made my breath hitch. She peeled the heavy fabric down my arms with a slow, deliberate movement. As the weight of the coat left me, I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. Without the heavy wool, I was just a woman in a silk blouse and trousers, standing in a stranger's living room. She hung the coat on a brass hook, treating the expensive garment with casual respect, then turned to me. Tea? Or are you hungry? I make a terrible omelet, but excellent toast. Tea is fine, I managed. Please. I watched her move to the kitchenette. It was separated from the living area only by a butcher block island. I saw her fill a kettle, her movements efficient but relaxed. There was no urgency here. In my world, everything was timed to the second. Clamp time, anesthesia duration, recovery metrics. Here, she waited for the water to boil, leaning her hip against the counter, watching me watch her. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a worn velvet sofa that looked like it had swallowed 1,000 conversations. "You look like you're waiting for a subpoena." I lowered myself onto the sofa. The cushions gave way, holding me softer than anything I owned. I looked around the room again, trying to reconcile the clutter with the peace I felt settling in my chest. "How do you live with all this?" I asked, gesturing to the books. "I like to be surrounded by stories," Luna said, the kettle whistling. She poured the water, the steam rising in a curling ribbon. "Keeps the silence from getting too loud." "What does your apartment sound like, Evelyn?" The question was a precision strike. She brought 2 mugs over, mismatched, heavy ceramic that held the heat, and set them on the coffee table before sitting on the floor opposite me. She didn't take the chair. She chose the lower ground, looking up at me, dismantling the hierarchy even further. "It sounds like the HVAC system," I admitted, my voice quiet. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my cold fingers. "It sounds like the ice maker in the fridge dropping cubes into an empty bin. It sounds like waiting." Luna studied me over the rim of her mug. Her eyes were dark, stripping away the last of my defenses. "You have the title. You have the money. You have the respect of everyone in that hospital. What did it cost you?" I looked down into the dark liquid of the tea. The steam dampened my face. "Everything else," I whispered. The confession tumbled out before I could check it. "I missed my sister's wedding because I was on call. I haven't had a second date in 4 years because I check my pager during dinner. I have a closet full of clothes for events I never attend and a kitchen I never cook in." I looked up at her, my vision blurring slightly. "I save lives every single day. I hold people's hearts in my hands and I fix them. But I go home and I don't know how to be a person. I don't know how to just exist without a purpose." "You're existing right now," Luna said softly. She reached out, her hand settling on the cushion next to my knee. "You're here, you're drinking tea, you're breathing, and the world hasn't ended." "It feels like it might," I said, a dry laugh catching in my throat. "It feels like if I stop moving, I'll never start again. That the exhaustion will just take me." "Then let it," she said. She leaned forward, closing the distance between the floor and the sofa. Her presence filled my senses, drowning out the fear. "You don't have to be strong here, Evelyn. You don't have to be the chief. You can just be tired." The words broke something inside me. The tension that had held my spine straight for 20 years snapped, not with a bang, but with a long, shuddering exhale. I slumped back into the velvet, the mug trembling slightly in my hands. Luna didn't look away. She didn't offer platitudes. She just held the space, a sanctuary of clutter and warmth, and waited for me to finally land. I set the mug down on the battered coffee table. The ceramic clinked against the wood, a sharp sound shattering the fragile quiet. My hands were shaking now, a visible tremor that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the sheer, overwhelming release of finally admitting the truth out loud. I had spent 20 years holding my breath, bracing for an impact that never came, and exhaling now felt dangerous. It felt like if I truly let go, I would simply disintegrate into a pile of dust and tailored wool right there. Luna didn't let that happen. She moved then, shifting from the floor to her knees, rising until she was eye level with me, where I slumped on the velvet sofa. She reached out, and this time there was no hesitation, no professional distance. Her hands, Those capable, observant hands that I had watched mix drinks in clear glass with such precision came up to frame my face. The contact was electric. Her palms were warm, rougher than mine, the skin calloused from work. But her fingers were gentle, tracing the line of my jaw where I held so much tension it ached. The silver rings she wore were cool against my flushed skin, a stark, grounding contrast that made me shiver violently. I closed my eyes, leaning into our touch. It was an anchor. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the one holding someone else together. I wasn't the steady hand. I was the one being held. "Look at me, Evelyn," she whispered. I forced my eyes open. She was so close now that I could see the flecks of gold in her dark irises, see the way her pupils dilated as she looked at me. There was no judgment in her gaze, no expectation, just a raw, open want that mirrored the hollow ache in my own chest. "I don't know how to do this," I confessed, my voice barely a thread. "I don't know how to be this." "You don't have to do anything," Luna murmured, her thumb brushing over my cheekbone. "Just be here. Just breathe." Her right hand slid down from my cheek, trailing a line of fire along the sensitive column of my throat, over the silk of my blouse, until it settled firmly on my waist. The weight of her hand there was heavy, possessive, and deeply grounding. It pulled me forward, out of the retreat of the sofa cushions and into her orbit. I felt the heat of her palm seeping through the fabric, branding me. It was a coordinate being plotted on a map I had lost long ago. My own hands, usually so disciplined, felt clumsy as they finally found purchase on her shoulders. I gripped the crisp cotton of her white shirt, needing to feel the solid reality of her beneath the fabric. She was warm. She was real. The scent of her skin was intoxicating, overriding the antiseptic smell of the hospital that always seemed to cling to my hair no matter how many times I showered. The air in the room thickened, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hair on my arms stand up. The logic center of my brain, the part that calculated risks and managed outcomes, went silent. There was no risk assessment for this. There was only the undeniable magnetic pull of her body against mine. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. We breathed the same air for a long, suspended moment. I could feel the steady rhythm of her heart beating against my chest, a counterpoint to the frantic fluttering of my own. "Tell me to stop," she breathed, her lips brushing against my cheekbone, sending sparks down my spine. "Tell me to leave, and I will." "Don't," I gasped, the word tearing out of me like a plea. "Don't you dare leave." I shifted, my legs parting slightly to allow her closer, destroying the last physical barrier between us. Her hand, on my waist, tightened, pulling me flush against her. The friction sent a shockwave through my nervous system that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with being alive. I buried my face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her scent, letting it fill my lungs. The world outside, the hospital, the board meetings, the lonely penthouse, ceased to exist. The only reality was the warmth of the apartment, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls, and the woman who had seen through my armor. I felt her other hand tangle in the hair at the nape of my neck. I let myself fall, knowing she would catch me. The darkness of the room closed in, soft and welcoming, swallowing us whole. I woke up to the absence of an alarm. In my world, the day began with a jarring digital tone at 4:30 a.m., a summons to consciousness that triggered an immediate cortisol spike. But here the only signal was the sunlight filtering through yellowed vintage curtains, casting warm, hazy squares across the unmade bed. I lay still for a long moment, my body heavy and unfamiliar in its relaxation. The frantic internal metronome that usually governed my pulse, check the schedule, check the vitals, check the emails, was silent. I was alone in the bed. The sheets were cotton, softened by 100 washes, smelling faintly of lavender detergent and the deeper, muskier scent of the woman who owned them. I reached out, my hand finding the indentation in the pillow beside me. It was cool, but the memory of the night before rushed back with a heat that made my breath catch. The unraveling, the way she had taken the weight of my existence and held it just for a few hours. For 20 years, I had woken up anxious. Today, I woke up whole. I sat up, the room swimming into focus. It was cluttered, yes, but in the daylight, the chaos looked like curation. Piles of art books, a stray earring on the nightstand, a dying succulent that clearly needed water. It was human. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my feet finding the worn hardwood floor. My suit was draped carefully over a chair, the armor waiting to be reclaimed, but I ignored it for now. I found my blouse, buttoning it with fingers that felt less stiff than usual, and followed the sound of movement down the short hallway. Luna was in the kitchen. She was wearing a gray t-shirt that had seen better days and a pair of flannel pajama pants, her hair pulled up in a messy knot that defied gravity. She was standing at the stove, focused on the sputtering of an old Italian espresso pot. The domesticity of the scene hit me harder than the intimacy of the bedroom. Sex was something I understood, physiologically and mechanically, but the quiet, unguarded rhythm of a Tuesday morning, was a foreign language. She turned as I entered, hearing the floorboards creak. Her face was bare, stripped of the dim bar lighting, and she looked younger, softer. "Coffee's almost ready," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. "I hope you don't take it with anything fancy, because I only have oat milk and sugar." "Black is fine," I said, leaning against the doorframe. I felt remarkably shy, stripped of my white coat and my authority. I usually drink it on the run. Sitting down for it feels illicit. "Well, call the police," she teased, pouring the dark liquid into 2 chipped mugs. She handed one to me, her fingers brushing mine. The contact was brief, but it grounded me instantly. "You slept like the dead, Evelyn. I didn't have the heart to wake you." "I haven't slept like that in a decade," I admitted, taking the mug. The coffee was strong, bitter, and perfect. I looked around the small, sun-drenched kitchen. Notes were stuck to the fridge, a half-eaten loaf of bread sat on the counter, and a radio played low-static jazz. It was messy, it was inefficient, and it was the most inviting space I had ever stood in. "I have to go," I said, the words tasting like ash. "I have rounds at 8. "I know," Luna said. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't cling. She leaned back against the counter, sipping her coffee, watching me with that same unnerving, seeing gaze. "But you're leaving differently than you arrived?" She was right. I went back to the bedroom and dressed, pulling on the charcoal trousers, the jacket, the expensive watch. The armor went back on, but it didn't fit the same way. It felt like a costume now, a necessary uniform for a role I was playing, rather than my entire identity. I checked my phone. 14 missed calls, 32 emails. The red notification light blinked furiously, a panic signal from a world that demanded my blood. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to apologize to the device. I walked back to the front door. Luna was waiting. She handed me my coat, her hands lingering on the lapels for a second longer than necessary. "You're going to be okay," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," I said. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. The old Evelyn would have left with a polite nod, closing the transaction. The new Evelyn, the one who had slept through the night, turned back. "I'm coming back, not tonight. I have a board meeting that will run late, but Thursday." Thursday. I'm off at 6. Luna smiled, and it was the same sharp, dangerous smile from the street, softened by the morning light. I'll be here. I'll make sure the coffee is better. I walked out of the apartment and down the 3 flights of stairs. The air outside was crisp, carrying the noise of the waking city. Sirens, garbage trucks, the shout of commuters. It was the same city I had walked through the night before, but the colors seemed sharper, the noise less abrasive. I hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat. As the driver pulled away, merging into the traffic that would take me back to the sterile, climate-controlled world of the hospital, I caught a scent on my own collar, cedar, warm skin, and the faint, bitter ghost of rosemary. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. It was a tether, a reminder that the cage had a door, and for the first time in my life, I held the key. I wasn't just returning to work. I was returning with a secret, a sanctuary, and a promise that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the diagnosis. It didn't happen overnight. You don't dismantle a fortress in a day. You take it apart brick by brick, examining the mortar of every defense mechanism before you discard it. 3 months after that morning, I resigned from the hospital's ethics committee. 2 weeks. Later, I set a hard boundary. No administrative emails after 8 p.m. unless a patient was actively dying. The silence in the boardroom when I announced the changes was absolute. My colleagues looked at me like I had grown a second head. The chief of staff asked if I was sick. He asked if I was having a midlife crisis. I looked him in the eye and told him I was simply correcting a critical error in my operating procedure. I was making time to survive. Luna became the new constant, the anchor point around which this new life orbited. It wasn't just a fling born of exhaustion and whiskey. It was a fundamental shift in my center of gravity. We navigated the collision of our worlds with a careful, deliberate patience. She brought life into my sterile penthouse, literally. She filled the empty, echoing corners with ferns and trailing ivy, plants that required the kind of daily, attentive care I used to reserve only for patients. In return, I learned to navigate the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood without checking my watch every 30 seconds. I learned that time wasn't an enemy to be beaten, but a resource to be spent slowly. We found a rhythm. Tuesday nights were for her bar, where I sat in the corner, not as a ghost haunting the establishment, but as a partner, waiting for the shift to end. Sunday mornings were for the fire escape at her place, drinking coffee out of those chipped mugs, feeling the rusty iron grate beneath my feet, and watching the city wake up below us. I learned to navigate the collision of our worlds. Real wealth became the sound of Luna's key turning in the lock at the end of a 14-hour shift. It was the way she looked at me across a crowded room, a secret frequency that cut through the noise and said, "I see you." It was the feeling of her hand on the small of my back, grounding me when the anxiety of the hospital threatened to pull me under. It was the luxury of being known, flawed, tired, and completely unmasked, and being wanted anyway. I went back to the hotel bar last week. It was my birthday again, 43. The setting was identical. The chrome, the glass, the hum of expensive conversation that sounded like static. But the woman sitting on the velvet stool was different. I wasn't wearing the armor. I was wearing a silk shirt Luna had picked out, the top button undone, the fabric moving with my breath. I wasn't drinking the scotch I hated just to prove I could handle the burn. I was nursing that same herbal cocktail, gin, rosemary, a touch of sweetness, savoring the complexity rather than using it as an anesthetic. I watched Luna work. She moved with that same predator's grace, managing the chaos of the service well, spinning bottles and sliding glasses with a dancer's precision. But every few minutes, her eyes would find mine in the mirror. And every time they did, the tension in my shoulders unspooled a little more. She had been right that first night with her terrifying, accurate assessment. I didn't need a drink. I didn't need a vacation. I needed to be human. I needed someone brave enough to reach across the marble counter, ignore the do not disturb sign I had hung around my neck, and pull me out of the ice. "Ready," she mouthed, catching my reflection as the lights dimmed for last call. I smiled, and it felt easy. I left the cash on the bar, a tip for the service, but mostly a tribute to the memory of the lonely woman who used to sit here waiting for a nothing. "Always," I whispered back. "The surgery is certainly still my vocation, but it's no longer my entire existence. My life is the walk to the car, the cold air on my face, and the warm, rough hand that slides into mine the moment we step outside. The diagnosis was correct. I just needed to be truly held." If you believe in finding the cure for deep loneliness in unexpected places, hit subscribe for more stories.